He put up the fence on a Tuesday and never once explained why. The day was grey and unforgiving, with a wind that carried the last chill of a reluctant winter. Arthur worked alone, his movements slow but deliberate, each one a study in aged efficiency. His son-in-law, Mark, had watched from the kitchen window for an hour, his coffee growing cold in his mug, a frown etched deep between his brows. The corner Arthur chose was the farm's ugliest wound. It was a jagged patch of less than an acre, where the good soil thinned to a stony crust. Gnarled roots from a long dead oak broke the surface like frozen lightning, and the ground was choked with thistle and burdock. For generations, it was known only as the wasted corner, a place the ploughs avoided and the cattle ignored. It produced nothing but rocks and regret. Arthur's tools were old, but they were his. The post-hole digger, its wooden handles worn smooth and dark with a lifetime of sweat, groaned with each turn. The wire spool creaked as he unrolled the fencing. He did not rush. He measured his posts, set them deep, and tamped the earth around them with a quiet finality. There was no anger in his work, no frustration. There was only a profound and unsettling patience. His daughter Sarah came out around noon, pulling her sweater tight against the wind. She carried a thermos and 2 sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. She stood by the new fence line, the wire a stark metallic line against the dead brown of the landscape. "Dad, what are you doing?" Her voice was gentle, laced with the familiar worry that had become her constant companion since her mother Elara had passed 2 years prior. Arthur paused his work. He straightened his back with a soft grunt and looked at the plot of land, not at her. "Fencing," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. "I can see that," Sarah said, her patience fraying. "But why? Why here? Mark says we should have brought the heavy tiller in years ago, tried to break it up for pasture. It's useless land." Arthur finally turned to her. His eyes, the colour of a faded sky, held a depth she could not read. He took the thermos and poured a cup of steaming coffee, his hand steady despite the tremor that sometimes lived there. "Your mother liked this corner," he said simply. It was not an explanation. It was a statement of fact, as solid and immovable as the granite stones he had spent the morning wrestling from the soil. That was all he would say. He ate his sandwich in silence, his gaze fixed on the tangled mess of weeds and rock. Sarah sighed, a small puff of white in the cold air. She felt a familiar pang of helplessness. Since Elara was gone, her father had retreated into a world of his own making, a place of silent work and unspoken memories. This fence felt like another wall he was building, not just around the land, but around himself. The community noticed, of course. In a place where every field had a purpose and every season had its rhythm, Arthur's project was a jarring note of discord. Neighbours slowed their trucks as they passed, their heads craned. At the grain co-op, men in dusty caps leaned against sacks of feed and speculated. Old Arthur's finally lost it, one would say, shaking his head. Fencing the rock pile. "Grief does strange things," another would offer, more charitably. He hasn't been the same since Elara died. Mark, his son-in-law, bore the brunt of the gentle mockery. He was a practical man, a farmer who believed in yield per acre and the cold, hard logic of profit and loss. The wasted corner was a loss, pure and simple. To see his father-in-law pouring time and expensive fencing into it was more than foolish. It felt like an insult to the very principles of farming. "He won't listen," Mark complained to Sarah that night, the frustration evident in the way he paced their small living room. "I told him, if he wants a project, we can clear the lower 40. We can put in a new irrigation line. But this, it's a waste of time, a waste of money. People are talking." Sarah looked out the window toward the dark shape of the farmhouse where her father lived alone. A single light burned in the kitchen. "He's not wasting time, Mark, he's using it. I just don't know what for." But what they didn't know, what no one could know, was that Arthur was not working from a place of grief-addled confusion. He was working from a plan, That night, after the house was quiet and the moon cast long shadows across the fields, Arthur sat at his worn kitchen table. The single light Sarah had seen was from the small lamp he used for reading. In front of him lay a book, its leather cover cracked and its pages softened by time. It was not a Bible, nor an almanac. It was Ilara's garden journal. He opened it to a page marked with a faded blue ribbon. Her handwriting, a graceful, looping script, filled the page. The entry was dated 30 years prior. April 10th, it began. The wild strawberries are showing their first leaves in the wasted corner. The soil there is poor, but they don't seem to mind. They are sweeter than any I have ever tasted. A little burst of sun on the tongue. Arthur says I should try to transplant them, but I think they belong there. Some things are best where they are planted, no matter how difficult the ground. Arthur traced the line of her writing with a calloused finger. This was his map. This was his blueprint. He had found the journal a month ago, tucked away in a cedar chest with her wedding dress. He had thought he knew everything about his wife, every story, every dream. But the journal revealed a secret world he had only glimpsed. It was a catalogue of the forgotten and the overlooked. Page after page detailed the wild native plants that grew on their land, plants that other farmers dismissed as weeds. She wrote of the tart flavour of the elderberries that grew in the damp ditch, the peppery bite of the wild arugula that sprouted after a spring rain, and the delicate, honey-like scent of the tiny alpine flowers that clung to the rocks in the wasted corner. Her entries were not just observations, they were instructions. The soil is thin, she wrote of the corner, but it drains well. Perfect for deep-rooted herbs that hate wet feet. The rocks hold the day's heat, creating a microclimate, a natural oven. She had sketched diagrams, noted bloom times, and even pressed flowers and leaves between the pages, their colours faded but their shapes perfectly preserved. Near the back of the book, on one of the last pages, was an entry from the year before she fell ill. I made a promise to that ugly little corner of the farm today, she wrote. That one day I would show everyone how beautiful it is. Not by changing it, but by helping it become what it was always meant to be. It holds so much life, if only you have the patience to look. Arthur closed the book. He had his own promise to keep now. He was not just fencing a plot of land. He was building a sanctuary for his wife's memory. He was finishing her last, most important project. The work began in earnest as spring finally broke. Arthur did not bring in a plough. His tools were a spade, a wheelbarrow, and his own 2 hands. He spent weeks on his knees, not clearing the land, but tending it. He pulled the thistles and the burdock, but left the delicate ferns and the strange, lacy-leafed plants Ilara had described. He worked around the gnarled oak roots, seeing them not as obstacles, but as features. He dug out rocks by the hundreds, not all of them, just enough to create small pockets of earth. He didn't haul them away. He used them to build low, winding walls within the enclosure, creating terraced beds and sheltered nooks. The sound of stone grating on stone became a familiar morning song. It was back-breaking labour. His shoulders ached, and his knees protested every time he knelt and rose. Mark watched him from a distance, shaking his head in disbelief. He's making rock piles, he told Sarah. He fenced in a rock pile, and now he's making smaller rock piles inside it. Arthur ignored the whispers. He was following Ilara's notes. The stones will act as a heat sink, she had written. They will protect the tender seedlings from the late frosts and keep the soil warm long after the sun has set. He could almost hear her voice as he worked, a gentle murmur over the whisper of the wind. He amended the soil, not with the chemical fertilizers Mark used on the cornfields, but with his own concoctions. He gathered pine needles from the woods, aged manure from the barn, and composted kitchen scraps. He hauled buckets of sand from the creek bed to improve the drainage in certain spots. Each pocket of earth was custom-made, a recipe taken directly from Ilara's journal for a specific plant he intended to place there. The first seedlings appeared in late spring. They were not the neat, orderly rows of corn or soybeans that patterned the rest of the valley. They were a chaotic jumble of shapes and textures. Strange, feathery herbs sprouted next to broad-leafed plants he had started from seeds collected in the wild. Tiny flowering vines began to climb the rock walls he had so painstakingly built. His son, Leo, called from the city. It was a rare event, usually prompted by a holiday or a birthday. "Sarah tells me you're gardening," Leo said, the word hanging awkwardly in the air between them. Leo had left the farm for college and never looked back. He was a junior analyst at some firm, a job Arthur didn't fully understand. All he knew was that his son wore a suit to work and saw the farm as a chapter of his life that was firmly closed. "I'm working," Arthur replied, his eyes on a patch of purple-stemmed mint he was cultivating. "On the wasted corner?" Leo's voice held a note of tired exasperation. "Dad, why don't you just let Mark handle the land? You're not a young man anymore. That piece of ground has never been worth anything." "Your mother didn't think so," Arthur said, his voice quiet. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Mum was a romantic," Leo said, his tone softening slightly. "You're supposed to be the practical one. Just take it easy, okay? Don't overdo it." The call ended, leaving Arthur with a familiar ache that had nothing to do with his muscles. It was the ache of being misunderstood by his own son. Leo saw the farm as something to escape. He saw his father's work as the pointless hobby of an old man. He could not see the love story being written in the dirt. A late frost descended in May, a cruel, unseasonable cold that threatened to undo weeks of labour. Sarah woke to find a crystalline sheen on the windows and rushed to her father's house. She expected to find him distraught, his project ruined. Instead, she found him calmly moving through the enclosure, covering his precious plants. He had dozens of old glass jars, the kind Alara used for canning peaches. He was placing them over the most delicate seedlings, creating miniature greenhouses. He had draped old bedsheets, worn thin with time, over the larger bushes. He had learnt this from her journal. "A late frost is a test of a gardener's love," she had written. "Protect what you have planted." He worked through the cold morning, his breath pluming in the air. Sarah stood at the fence, her earlier worry replaced by a dawning sense of awe. This was not madness. This was devotion. She didn't offer to help. She knew instinctively that this was his ritual, his conversation with her mother. She just watched, and for the first time, she began to believe. Summer arrived slowly, then all at once. The heat settled over the valley, shimmering above the asphalt roads and turning the cornfields into a sea of green. And in the wasted corner, something miraculous began to happen. The chaotic jumble of plants exploded into a riot of colour and life. It was not a garden in any conventional sense. It was a tapestry. Deep purple basil grew beside silver-leafed sage. Tiny, star-shaped blue flowers, which Alara's journal called borage, carpeted the ground beneath sprawling squash vines that produced strange, striped gourds. Scarlet runner beans spiraled up a trellis Arthur had fashioned from willow branches, their fiery blossoms a beacon for hummingbirds. And the berries. On the sunniest, rockiest slope, the wild strawberry plants his wife had so admired were thriving. They were laden with fruit, smaller than their commercial cousins, but intensely red. Interspersed with them were bushes bearing golden raspberries, black currants, and tiny dark berries Arthur had never seen before, which the journal identified as huckleberries, a mountain delicacy. The smells were intoxicating. A breeze passing over the enclosure carried a complex perfume of mint, lemon balm, lavender, and the honeyed scent of 1,000 tiny blossoms. The sound was a low, constant hum. The corner had become a haven for pollinators. Bees, which had been scarce in the valley due to the monoculture of the surrounding farms, swarmed the flowering herbs. Butterflies of every colour danced in the air. Arthur's grandchildren, Sarah's 2 young children, were the first to truly discover its magic. They had been wary of the corner, having heard the adults' dismissive talk. But one afternoon, drawn by the vibrant colors, they peered through the fence. Grandpa, his 7-year-old granddaughter Lily, asked, her nose pressed to the wire mesh. "What is all this?" Arthur, who was weeding a patch of chamomile, smiled. It was the first genuine, untroubled smile Sarah had seen on his face in years. He unlatched the gate. "Come and see," he said. He walked them through the winding stone paths. He showed them how to pinch a leaf of lemon balm and rub it between their fingers to release the scent. He picked a borage flower and told them to taste it. "It tastes like a cucumber," his grandson Sam exclaimed in wonder. He led them to the strawberry patch. He showed them how to find the ripest berries, hidden beneath the leaves. The children ate them straight from the plant, their faces soon smeared with red juice. "They're so sweet." Lily cried, her voice full of awe. "They're better than the ones from the store." They were speechless. The place they had known as a wasteland, a scary, weed-filled corner, was now an enchanted garden, a treasure trove of smells, tastes, and colors. They spent the rest of the afternoon exploring, their earlier fears forgotten, replaced by a sense of wonder. The turning point with the wider community came in the form of a man named Julian Croft. Croft was the head chef of a renowned restaurant in a city 2 hours away, a place with a month-long waiting list and prices that made local farmers' eyes water. He had a summer home in the hills and was known for foraging in the woods for unique, local ingredients. One sweltering July afternoon, his car broke down on the road bordering Arthur's farm. While waiting for a tow truck, he wandered along the fence line, stretching his legs. He was drawn by the hum of the bees. When he saw what was inside the enclosure, he stopped dead. He was a man who knew plants. He could identify herbs by their leaves and flowers by their scent. What he saw in Arthur's garden was not just a collection of plants. It was a curated masterpiece of heirloom and native species, many of which he had only read about in old botanical texts. He saw 5 varieties of mint, 3 types of thyme, edible flowers he hadn't seen in a decade, and berries that simply weren't commercially available. He stood there for a long time, his sophisticated city demeanor melting away, replaced by the pure excitement of a connoisseur who had just stumbled upon a hidden treasure. Arthur, seeing the stranger, came over to the fence. He was wary of outsiders. "Can I help you?" Arthur asked, his voice neutral. "I hope so," the chef said, his eyes wide with amazement. "My name is Julian Croft. Did you grow all this?" Arthur nodded slowly. "This is incredible," Croft breathed, pointing to a patch of small, purple striped peppers. "That's a fish pepper, an heirloom from the 19th century. And that," he said, gesturing to a delicate, fern-like herb, "is that French chervil? I can't find real chervil anywhere." For the next hour, the 2 men stood at the fence line and talked about plants. Croft did most of the talking, his voice filled with an excitement that bordered on reverence. Arthur listened, offering quiet, one-word answers. Finally, the tow truck arrived. "Listen," Croft said, pulling a business card from his wallet. "I want to buy from you. I'll buy everything. Your berries, your herbs, those squash blossoms. I will pay you whatever you ask. What you have here, this is not just gardening. This is art." Arthur looked at the small white card. He had never thought about selling anything. This was for Alara. But then he looked at the vibrant, thriving patch of land. It was producing far more than he and his family could ever use. It was life overflowing its banks. Perhaps sharing it was part of the promise too. "I'll have to think on it," Arthur said. Word of the chef's visit spread through the valley with the speed of a summer grass fire. The story was embellished with each telling. The fancy city man had offered Arthur a fortune. He had declared the wasted corner a national treasure. The mockery that had followed Arthur for months evaporated, replaced by a mystified curiosity. The same neighbours who had shaken their heads in pity now slowed their trucks to stare in admiration. The men at the co-op no longer joked about Arthur losing his mind. They talked about the city chef and the mysterious plants. Mark was the most bewildered of all. He walked the perimeter of the fence, staring at the riot of life within. He didn't understand the plants, but he understood the language of success. He understood the hum of the bees, a sound that had been missing from his own fields. His vast acres of corn were a sterile monoculture, dependent on chemical sprays. This small, forgotten corner was pulsing with a vitality his modern efficient methods could not replicate. He found Arthur sitting on a stone bench inside the enclosure, carefully sorting seeds into small paper envelopes. The air was thick with the scent of lavender. "Arthur," Mark began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. He twisted the brim of his hat in his hands. I was wrong." Arthur looked up, his expression unreadable. "I didn't get it," Mark continued, stumbling over the words. "I saw rocks and weeds. I didn't see this. That chef, he really wants to buy this stuff." "He does," Arthur said. Mark shook his head, a slow gesture of defeat and wonder. "How did you know? How did you know any of this would grow here?" For the first time, Arthur decided to share his secret. He beckoned Mark inside the gate and led him to the small bench. He went into the house and returned with Elara's journal, its pages worn and soft. He opened it to a page describing the soil composition of the corner. "Elara knew," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. "She saw it all years ago. I'm just the hired hand, finishing the job." Mark took the journal, his big, work-roughened hands surprisingly gentle. He stared at his mother-in-law's elegant script, at the pressed flowers and the detailed sketches. He had loved Elara, but he had always seen her gardening as a quaint hobby, a feminine pastime. He saw now that it had been a science, an art, a deep and profound wisdom he had been too arrogant to recognize. He spent the next hour reading, the silence in the garden broken only by the buzz of the bees and the rustle of leaves. Arthur did make a deal with Julian Croft. The chef's van began making weekly trips to the farm, returning to the city laden with carefully packed boxes of herbs, berries, and edible flowers. The money that came in was more than Arthur had ever expected. The farm, which had been struggling to break even for years, was suddenly on solid financial footing. But Arthur didn't change his life. He didn't buy a new truck or a bigger television. The first check he wrote was to his neighbour, a young farmer whose dairy herd had been hit hard by disease. He paid off the man's vet bills, anonymously. The second thing he did was buy a new set of swings for the small park in the village. He began to expand the project, but not in the way Mark would have. He didn't try to replicate the garden on a larger scale. Instead, he focused on the bees. He bought a dozen hives and placed them along the edge of the enclosure, with Elara's garden providing a constant, diverse source of nectar from early spring to late fall. The bee colonies thrived. His bees, in turn, began to transform the landscape beyond his fence. They were tireless workers, travelling for miles. The neighbouring farms began to see better pollination in their own crops. The apple orchard down the road had its best yield in a generation. The alfalfa fields were thicker and healthier. Arthur's quiet corner was healing the whole valley, one bee at a time. He started teaching too, though he would never have called it that. When people stopped to ask about a certain plant, he would invite them in. He would show them the corresponding page in Elara's journal. He saved seeds from every plant, storing them in meticulously labelled jars in his pantry. He gave them away freely to anyone who asked, along with a quiet piece of advice on how and where to plant them. Small patches of borage and lemon balm began appearing in kitchen gardens throughout the community. He was not just sharing seeds, he was sharing his wife's legacy. The news of the farm's transformation eventually reached Leo in the city. It came in fragments through conversations with his sister. He heard about the fancy chef, the money, the bees. It sounded absurd, like a fairy tale. It didn't square with the dusty, failing farm he had been so eager to leave behind. In his mind, the farm was a symbol of his family's small-town limitations. His life in the city, with its spreadsheets and quarterly reports, was supposed to be the real success, but his success was proving to be hollow. A corporate merger led to downsizing, and his position, which had felt so secure, was eliminated. He found himself adrift in a city that suddenly felt cold and indifferent. He was 32 years old, unemployed, with a mountain of debt from a lifestyle he could no longer afford. Humbled and with nowhere else to go, he packed his car and drove home. He arrived late on a warm evening in early autumn. The farm looked the same, yet different. As he pulled into the driveway, his headlights swept across the wasted corner. It was no longer dark and menacing. It was illuminated by solar-powered garden lights Arthur had installed, casting a soft glow on the winding paths and lush foliage. It looked magical. He found his father in the kitchen, poring over Elara's journal. The reunion was strained. Leo felt a deep, biting shame. He had come home a failure, returning to the very place he had defined himself by escaping. "I lost my job," Leo said, the admission tasting like ash in his mouth. Arthur just nodded. He got up and poured his son a glass of water. There was no "I told you so." There was no judgment in his eyes. There was only a quiet acceptance. The next morning, Arthur woke Leo at dawn. "Come on," he said. "I need a hand." Leo followed him out to the garden, his city clothes feeling flimsy and inadequate. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and mint. Arthur handed him a pair of gloves. "The honey," Arthur said, pointing to the buzzing hives. "It's time." Leo had never worked with bees. He was terrified. But he watched his father, whose movements were calm and hypnotic. He learned how to use the smoker to calm the hive, how to lift the heavy frames dripping with honeycomb. He felt the sticky warmth of the honey on his gloves, smelled its rich floral sweetness. He saw the intricate, perfect geometry of the comb. For the first time in a long time, he was doing something real. He wasn't analyzing data or forecasting profits. He was holding something tangible, something created from sunlight, flowers, and the tireless labor of thousands of tiny creatures. He spent the next weeks working alongside his father. He repaired fences, tilled soil, and learned the names of the plants in Elara's garden. He read his mother's journal, not as a curiosity, but as a textbook. He saw the farm not through the lens of youthful shame, but through the eyes of a man searching for purpose. He discovered he had a role to play. His father was a brilliant gardener, a man who understood the earth. But he was lost when it came to invoices and scheduling deliveries. Leo, with his business background, took over that side of the operation. He created a website for the farm. He contacted other chefs in the city, sending them sample boxes. He started a subscription service for local families who wanted a weekly share of the garden's bounty. He was using the skills he had learned in the corporate world, but now they had meaning. They were serving something vital and alive. He was bridging his father's world and his own, creating something new and sustainable. The estranged son had finally come home, not in defeat, but to find his true calling. The following summer, the farm hosted a community picnic. It was Sarah's idea. She wanted to celebrate. The entire town was invited. They set up long tables near the wasted corner, which was now known simply as Elara's garden. The tables were laden with food, much of it made from the garden's produce. There were salads sprinkled with edible flowers, bread served with herbed butter, and pitchers of iced tea sweetened with honey from Arthur's hives. Mark stood beside the grill, flipping burgers, a genuine smile on his face. He was now Arthur's most devoted student, and he was experimenting with planting pollinator-friendly cover crops between his rows of corn. He often brought his own children to the garden, teaching them the names of the herbs his father-in-law had taught him. Leo moved among the crowd, talking to local business owners about carrying their honey and jams. He looked comfortable and confident, his city pallor replaced by a healthy, sun-kissed glow. He had found his place. Arthur sat on his stone bench, watching it all. He watched Lily and Sam, their faces no longer speechless with wonder, but joyful with familiarity. As they led other children on tours of the garden, pointing out their favorite berries, he watched his neighbors who had once mocked him, now walking the stone paths with expressions of quiet admiration. He saw the life that had sprung from a patch of forgotten land, a life that was now nourishing his family and his entire community. He felt a gentle breeze, carrying the scent of lavender and honey, and he could almost feel Elara's hand on his shoulder. He had kept his promise. Her garden was not just alive, it was thriving, and it had brought everything else along with it. His quiet, solitary act of faith, born from love and memory, had blossomed into a legacy that would feed and sustain them all for years to come. So you see, the story of Arthur and his farm is a simple one, but it holds a profound truth. It's a story about the power of quiet perseverance in a world that too often celebrates the loud and the new. It's a reminder that what one person dismisses as a wasteland, another, with patience and vision, can transform into a paradise. Arthur's journey shows us that the most valuable things are rarely the ones that are easy or obvious. True worth is often hidden beneath a rough exterior, waiting for someone with the heart to see it and the hands to cultivate it. His neighbors saw only rocks and weeds. He saw the potential for life, guided by a love that transcended time and a wisdom that was written on the pages of an old journal. This story is a testament to the idea that we should never write off a person or a piece of land as worthless. The world is full of wasted corners and underestimated people, filled with a potential that is simply waiting for a chance to bloom. It reminds us that sometimes the most revolutionary act is to quietly tend to a small patch of earth, to trust in a process that others don't understand, and to have faith that your love and labor will, in time, bear fruit. In a way, Arthur's work is a beautiful metaphor for faith itself. He took a piece of creation that was judged and forgotten, and by pouring his love and dedication into it, he helped it reveal its hidden glory. He didn't impose his will upon the land, he listened to it. He learned its secrets and helped it become the best version of itself. Is this not what we are all called to do? To see the divine potential in the overlooked, to nurture the forgotten, and to have faith that even from the rockiest soil, something beautiful and life-giving can grow. He honored the memory of his wife, not by building a cold stone monument, but by bringing her most cherished dream to life, creating a living, breathing memorial that nourished an entire community. His success was not a victory over his detractors, but a gentle invitation for them to see the world in a new way. And in the end, that is the most powerful kind of triumph.